Good afternoon, everyone. This is Fritzkin. We're back with our afternoon session. I hope you all had a chance to take a look at the posters. I know that those folks put a lot of effort into the posters, and I was able to go out and look at most of them, and there's a lot of good information. Those are available to you even after the session, so you can go take a look at them. And I believe most of them had an email link in the poster itself if you want to do a follow-up question with any of the folks that did those posters. So next on the agenda, we have we're really excited about this. We have an opportunity to speak to someone that really, I think, is bringing a fresh view to an agency that we all have had some concerns about over the last few years. So with us today, we have Dr. Catherine Lemos, with the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. Dr. Lemos is a lifelong safety professional. She was nominated in June of 2019 by President Donald Trump to serve 2 concurrent 5-year terms as the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board as the chairman and board member. The Senate confirmed these appointments in March of 2020, and she began her post in April of 2020. The chairperson is the CEO of the board and exercises the executive and administrative functions of the board. Prior to her confirmation, Dr. Lemos served as the director of Northrop Grumman's Corporation's aerospace sector, driving performance improvements across the product lifecycle and value streams. Previous to this, Dr. Lemos served as a federal career servant. She was a technical leader and program manager in aircraft certification and aviation safety at the Federal Aviation Administration. She also worked for the National Transportation Safety Board as a senior human performance investigator in aviation safety, as well as a special assistant to vice chairman of the board, which provided her exposure to investigations across all modes and safety board operations. In academia, Dr. Lemos focused her research on decision-making in the aviation and medical space, studying the influence of information and technology on beliefs and behaviors to more reliably yield safe outcomes during risky and uncertain conditions. She conducted applied research to balance the strengths of technology and humans for optimal performance. From an academic perspective, Dr. Lemos earned a BBA from Belmont University, a Master's of Science from California Lutheran University, and a PhD from the University of Iowa, go Big Ten, and has served as a professor teaching and mentoring. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine Lemos. Dr. Lemos?
Thank you so much for having me here today. I look forward to our engagement, discussion, and getting to know you. So tell me how you'd like to proceed.
Yeah, so I've got a few questions for you here. So, you've been at the agency for a little over a year now. What's your initial perspective? What have you learned so far?
So I can tell you it's been a superb opportunity to learn from and get to know stakeholders in the chemical domain of the safety community, because I feel like I've been in the safety community across domains for many years, for most of my career. And this is a new domain, and it's been a wonderful community to meet.
Cool. What do you see, in your relatively short time at the CSB, of the value of the Chemical Safety Board for our industry, and what impacts, from a positive perspective, can the Chemical Safety Board bring to our industry?
So I don't think this would be different even for this domain, but the value of the CSB and what it brings is independence, objectivity, and a comprehensive perspective to the review of safety process and the practices. And this is across a even more broad range of chemical facilities with a diverse or distributed oversight structure. So we're not talking about aviation, which has the FAA, and they are over all of aviation. Now, granted, the NTSB has 4 other transportation domains. This is really a very distributed network and an opportunity to bring that together. OSHA, EPA, BSEE, you name it. And learning from the mistakes of others is certainly critical and meaningful. But I'd say that our most significant impact is in the recommendations that we issue to remedy identified safety gaps to raise the bar for our community. So I'm a big advocate of our recommendations and the importance of that in the investigative life cycle.
Great. We're going to come back to that recommendation piece in just a minute. But before that, I understand that you've had an opportunity to visit a few refineries. And I just wondered what your initial takeaways and impressions of your visits to those refineries were.
What stood out most for me is the level of safety metrics and culture that was being fostered and achieved. It was impressive. I admire what the safety team at AFPM is striving to accomplish. I learned a lot about that. And as an example, the risk assessment and mitigation techniques for refineries using hydrofluoric acid. I mean, that's just one example of the many things I was introduced to that it's critical for me to, and our teams to be able to understand. So those are my biggest takeaways. It was a great learning experience, and I look forward to more interaction with other groups.
Great. So let's pivot back to the recommendations and kind of the whole report process. And, this is an area that I think we all probably have some of our concerns around. And, in the past, and I know we're under a new administration and a new chairperson, but in the past, this is an area where maybe it hasn't gone that well, at least from our perspective, where it seems like there's a long lag from the incident to the investigation process to recommendations. So could you give us some insight into what you're doing, what things you're doing at the agency or the board to make these things more process driven and timely, possibly?
Okay, so I'll start out with saying that the CSB is on upward trajectory, and I'm really enthusiastic about and proud of our success. So our performance this fiscal year, and I know that not everybody goes by the government fiscal year, right? But in meeting our mandate already far exceeds that for the previous fiscal year, much less the several prior to that. And as a matter of education, we can divide our performance into 5 categories. We have investigation deployments. And this fiscal year, we're up 150%. We have investigations that are complete, three this year that we're working on versus 1. Safety recommendations issued, new safety recommendations issued. We're already at 9 versus 0 from last year, and that's going to change with the new investigations likely. We have safety recommendations that are advanced, which means they've gone from unsatisfactory to satisfactory or the other direction. And in the last fiscal year, it was 46, and now it's 15. And safety recommendations closed. We've already closed 28 successfully this year versus 4 last year. And so I'm very performance driven, and I'm excited about the fact that despite the performance of our past, I am driven to ensure that we meet the community's needs in a timely fashion.
So, to do that and to meet that goal, that takes people. So could you talk to us, we know that there's pending board member ratifications out there. We all have a sense that maybe the Chemical Safety Board staffing levels were somewhat decimated under the previous administration. Could you talk to us about what you're doing to get your staff built back up and get qualified investigators, and what your vision for the new board members are?
So yes, I'm going to back up a little bit because all of these topics come together a little bit. But the first thing was to focus internally last year when I joined, and to really better understand what are our processes for the CSB work product. And we refreshed our internal report processes and products, which is going to help us with efficiency in the future. So this, getting back to efficiency, is staffing is including, and trust me, I'll get there. We're also increasing the range of our investigative products to allow for flexibility in the level of investment based on the potential safety impact. So not everything is going to be an all or nothing full investigation with every single potential item covered. We're going to allow ourselves the flexibility, because we have limited resources, as all of us do, to invest in those that after deployment, or say there wasn't a deployment and then we can choose to deploy later. A lot of times the facilities need opening and are not open at first. So we can change, we can scale up and we can scale down an investigation, or we can include it in a group of investigative summaries for the best impact of the community. And I think that's really important. Speaking of board members, we prioritized and completed a multi-year request from the Inspector General of the EPA to address clarity in board member roles and responsibilities. And I am committed to ensuring that any new board member or group of board members that join, that we work together as a team. And that's really important. And my guess is you've experienced some of that or have heard a little bit about it. In terms of the staffing, we currently have open posts for across the agency for support staff as well as for investigators. And as you know, it takes computers and contracts and HR and everything to really get the system moving. And we did lose quite a bit of people. I'd say FY19, I think, was the lowest year of staffing level. And we ramped up in FY20. I can't take all the credit for that, but we're continuing to ramp up. The mission product team, what I'd like to impress upon everybody here is that the mission product team encompasses not just investigators, but it's also recommendation specialists. So if you complete an investigation and you come up with your probable cause and you come up with your findings, we all learn from that. But the recommendations, if they're not attended to and advocated for, which is definitely the role of not just the staff, but most importantly, the board members. Without board members, you can't advocate for those recommendations. And therefore, the safety bar may not change, right? You'll get learnings and takeaways. So that's really important to know, that investigators is only one aspect of the mission product team, and then the support teams are critical, as you know, for any business to function, business, finance. So we're also working to hire across, like we had in the past at our agency. We had people who were in different stages of their career life cycle. We need better succession planning. And we also need people with a diverse sets of knowledge and skill. Human factors could be one of them, or human performance. So we need to diversify our experience and the skill sets. So I hope that does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I would like to just kind of expand on the advocacy. You know, could you give us a little bit more insight into that life cycle of a recommendation? So, you know, going through the investigation, you come up with some root cause type thing, and then coming out of that would be a recommendation to OSHA or to some, you know, body that has a standard for that particular thing. What's that advocacy look like? How do you see that happening?
So the board, the way that this type of agency is designed is to focus and prioritize the key critical drivers. We have something called the critical drivers list, which was created maybe back when Chairman or Chairperson Sutherland was here. It's similar to the most wanted list. And so those things, those prioritized recommendations are the ones that board members should be out on the road advocating for and interacting with the parties to see what we can do to get to accomplish and to close those successfully. If we do our jobs well, we're interacting with the potential recipients in advance to ensure that they have the actual authority to do it. And if not, then we help them push for the authority to get it or the additional funding. And I think about this with a recommendation we made to OSHA recently, and I appreciate Mr. Frederick's comments on staffing up. It's a real challenge if you don't have enough staff to execute on the priorities that you have, just like us, right? We all have to prioritize. But if you don't close on the recommendations that raise the safety bar, then it's just learnings, and we don't really know the impact unless we're collecting a lot of safety data regarding incidents. I mean, there's no real way to know how you're raising the bar unless you're putting forth those recommendations and closing on them successfully. And I think back to a congressional statement that Carolyn Merritt made back in, I want to say 2002 maybe, or 3, and she reported the number of successful closures, not just the number of new recommendations. So that is going to be a really strong, it's going to be a topic that I'm going to invest a lot in, and I'm going to work with our new board members to ensure that we each have a set of core critical drivers, that it's data driven, as well as our specialty topics, which is based on your knowledge set or something that you're going to learn about. So I really think it's important that we focus on the recommendations, not just the investigations closed.
Okay, great. Sticking with this theme for just a second, you know, how are you going to ensure going forward that you've engaged all the right people or parties involved with the investigation? You know, it can be multifaceted, and how are you going to, one, play well with other agencies, and then make sure that, you know, important stakeholders are engaged in the investigative and recommendation process?
That's a great question, and I really appreciate it. There is, first of all, I brought on to the staff Mr. Bruce Walker, who has critical and key connections with ATF and others that we need to develop MOAs with that we haven't had previously. We've had some memorandums of understanding, but having that seamless, interactive, and non-competitive environment is really important. The second thing is something, I'll bring up what I call a party system, and it's the party system, party means party member. Now we're having a fiesta. But if you've been introduced to the NTSB, especially for those of you who are on pipeline, it involves a greater investment from the key stakeholders that can contribute to the factual element of the investigative report early on, and it ensures for more consistency of process, and then we're releasing information early on in press releases through Mr. Walker and our interaction with government relations and the public to make sure that any important facts are getting out on the street right away. But if we were to adopt this system or a like system that is right-sized or right-scaled for the CSB that the NTSB has, we have stakeholders from unions, we have stakeholders from the company, as well as the regulators, as well as critical guidance associations, etc., that are able to contribute. It's more efficient because we get the information from them. And I'll give a few examples. If we had a company or manufacturer level, the team representative could identify for us the policies and the procedures that are most relevant to the event, instead of asking for just give us everything and we have to sift through it, right? And likewise, an EPA or OSHA representative, or BSEE, could identify the current regulations related to the event, as well as any new technology, new process coming down the pipe that we weren't aware of. And that's really important because that takes a lot of time for our investigators. I know, having been one, had I not had that education brought to us, and had I not formed teams, I mean, you form a team, it's under the umbrella of the NTSB, or in this case, the Chemical Safety Board. You bring them into that process, and then you ensure that the factual information is accurate and complete. And that's really important. So I think that is probably even if we don't institute a more formal version of this, we've been doing, some version of this in the past, depending on board members, depending on managing directors or not. But I believe this is really important to ensure the input from the stakeholders. And I'll tell you this, one more thing. Even if a member or a person from the public or community is not a stakeholder or a party member to that investigation team, which comes with rules, right? That doesn't mean you can't provide input at any time throughout the investigation on your recommended probable cause based on their perspective and recommendations and findings. And all of that is considered by staff. And even more importantly, every board member has to read that. All of those inputs, those formalized inputs, even if it's not the entire report, it is their assessment of the issue and what needs to be considered. And there are many reviews of that information, meetings that follow prior to board member voting of the final product. I hope that answers your question, Fritz.
It does, very, very thoroughly, and I appreciate that insight.
All right.
So I want to pivot away from the actual board itself and maybe kind of get a little bit more on a personal level and what you bring to the board, or at least from my perspective, what I think you bring to the board, which hasn't been there before. One of the things that as a refining and petrochemical industry, we're really interested in, and we're trying to dip our toe in the water of the human performance and human reliability area. And some of our member companies are further along than others. And we've talked a lot at our last conferences, our last 3 or 4 conferences. We've had keynote speakers, we've had pre-conference workshops on human performance and human and organizational performance. But your academic preparation and your career, your work career, has spent a lot of time, and I know a lot of your thought process and brain cells have probably gone a lot towards this space, and you probably stayed awake night thinking about human performance issues. So could you give us some insight from your aviation experience, possibly? We know that we've looked at that from a highly reliable organization. We want the planes to fly and land safely, commercially, for sure. And I think your bio talked a little bit in the medical space. So when we're going to go have an operation, we want the operation to be on the right leg or the right place. So could you give us some insight into what you think are the important elements there, maybe some examples, or how we could learn from the work that you've done in your past experience?
I couldn't love this question more. So you're going to have to stop me if I get too long-winded on this. Right. So exactly, refining involves high-risk operations, which HRO, it's really sort of ironic, HRO, high-risk operations, high reliability operations, because that's what's required to mitigate the high risk, right? So you're absolutely right in that this started, maybe in aviation and aircraft carriers and whatnot. I'll tell you what's in common. All human operators struggle with the same needs for information, robust procedures, and training. And I'm not just talking about software, but for hardware and mechanical elements. We need frequent practice and currency, especially for emergency procedures. We need to consider human capacity, such as workload, monitoring, and fatigue. So not just the negatives, but what people do well, right? And management needs to develop and reinforce a safety culture versus a safety climate. I mean, we can get more into that later. But throughout my career, I've talked about the importance of safety at all phases of the life cycle, from the system or facility design early on to operations and maintenance. As you know, having been in research and having been in accident investigation in the middle of regulation, and at companies, you have to deal with the whole entire life cycle. And what I would say is that even for established refineries, I'm excited to learn about what new facilities there are, but even for established facilities, maybe even dealing with older technologies, there are many elements to design that we can still impact. So it's not just the software interfaces, but the design of procedures and training. And I think procedures and training are highly underrated as contributing to safety, my perspective and my experience, because it's in the examples, if you would like me to provide some, certainly it would have been ideal if we designed it out of the system to begin with. And for equipment upgrades and enhancements, we need to ensure that safety programs are involved early in the capital planning process, and to include both operations, right, operators and manufacturers in the process. And Jim Fredericks said something about this, including operators. The operators, your frontline operators, are your experts. If we do not include them in the design process and upgrade process, we're going to miss out. So if you think it worthwhile, I have some examples. I can provide them.
Yeah, I think a couple examples would be great. We have time.
Oh, excellent. All right, so I'm looking at the time here. How much time do we have?
We've got about 16, 17 minutes.
All right, okay. So I'll first provide an example from aviation. And the situation is that the earlier model of Boeing 737 flight decks were designed with an oral alert that signified two different dangers or immediate threats. When on the ground, the alert signified a misconfiguration, so maybe a flap setting before you take off, which is detrimental. So at altitude, the alert signified a pressurization issue, which means that likely you're going to have immediate or impending oxygen deprivation unless you descend. And the alert was rarely triggered during flight operations. They tested these things on the ground typically, and that might have been part of the problem, right? We have, if you think of Pavlov, and maybe most of us have taken a psychology 101 class, you have a ding and you have a response, right? And so what happened is pilots were trained to test this alert only on the ground prior to departing from the gate. And so there was such a strong association between that alert and the ground configuration issue that when they experienced it during flight, At altitude, the first thing they did was check their flaps, and they were very confused. Very few instances that we learned about did they actually check their pressurization. And in one case, which you may remember, in 2005, there was a Helios Airways accident. The crew was incapacitated because they were trying to figure out what was wrong with their flap setting, and they couldn't figure it out. And by that time, they were overcome by hypoxia, right? And unfortunately, all souls on board perished, and that was 121 to include 115 passengers and 6 crew. So the resolution for that is a software modification. You don't have to redesign the whole plane. You create a unique oral alert for each very dangerous or life-threatening threat. So that was, after we had a number of incidents and really didn't catch it, then we had, of course, Helios, and then recognize that was an issue. Any questions before I go on to another example from aviation, and then I have one from chemical?
No, I think that's good. We're ready for the next one.
Okay, so about 10 years ago, we were having a number of, again, Boeing, I'm not speaking of Boeing, I promise, but 747-200, and this was the older model, which you have 3 pilots, you had a flight engineer. They suffered a series of gear-up landings, and we couldn't figure out why. Nothing was fatal. It was a matter of a lot of aircraft damage. They're going off the runways. They're landing with their nose gear up, which, as you can imagine, so if you have an aircraft with four main gear under the wings and the 4 engines, and then you have one on the nose, it's not a great thing to land with your nose gear retracted. So there were very well-written procedures about what to do if you get this alert. And in most cases, the crew did a go-around, in which case they did not land. They were out circling and decided to go through the checklist. And many, many, many times they went through the checklist, right? And what you would hear is the checklist says ensure green status for all 5 gear. And you would hear the captain say this, and then you would hear the flight engineer say 4 green, good to go. And the captain would say, great, okay, so we're gonna read this again. 5, check all 5, and say 4 green, good to go. And no one noticed this. And then what we realized is that the panel for the flight engineer control system grouped the 4 main landing lights together, and then the front gear light was above it. And so they were only looking at the 4. It was a high workload, high stress environment. So the solution at this point, the 747-200 was turning into a cargo aircraft and less, so less risk. They were being phased out because we could afford 3 pilots, right? 3 crew. So the solution is a placard overlay, which Boeing created to really group all 5 together. So if they have this alert, they knew to check the top one. And if there was an issue, then they got on the phone with dispatch and maintenance to try to resolve it. So that's, I really think that's a great example of the fact that we can find solutions to issues for older technologies. It's not just about, as much as we'd like to have it early in the design phase, if it's not, we can redesign a system if it's not warranted based on the population and based on the number of systems like that remaining.
Okay, I think we have time for your chemical example, and then we have one more thing that I've had a couple of questions from the group about, or at least one question from the group about that I want to finish up with.
Okay, sounds great. So in the chemical domain, from our recently closed Aghorn report, we learned of a safety issue concerning alerts for the detection of high quantities of hydrogen sulfide. And this happened to be at a water flood station. So if detected, the system control panel would initiate an automated telephone call to the operator to alert them. The system also included a visual alert, which was a rotating beacon light on top of the facility. In this case, the detection and alert system was not functioning, and therefore the phone call wasn't made, the automated phone call wasn't made to the operator who came to fix another issue. And also there was no alert. The light was not functional. And so looking into this, the sensors that were in place, some were set to testing, which means they were not transmitting or non-reporting mode, and others were simply not functional. They just didn't work. And we also found that there was no evidence of testing this. There were no procedures for employees to be attentive to the status of the system when they arrived at the facility. In this particular case, the operator left their H2S detector, personal H2S detector in the truck, and then went inside this facility. On top of that, there were no alerts inside the facility, which were visual or oral when he was completing his work, which led to his demise and that of his wife later. So in summary on some of those topics, high threat situations require multiple alerts that are effective for the unique environment, and especially in high noise environments, whether you're on an aircraft carrier with earmuffs on, or many of the loud environments that we have in your domain, in the chemical domain, and in the refinery domains, you're gonna really need to develop, we need to develop, if we don't have it already, to ensure that the alerts are multiple when very threatening, and accommodate the environment in which the operator is in.
Yep, good examples. We appreciate that. Hey, the last thing I think is on everyone's mind is one of the most recent things that the Chemical Safety Board has done is the accidental release reporting rule. And we're just wondering where the, is there going to be additional guidance where that may stand, and kind of your perspective on the new rule and where it may go here as we get a better understanding of it?
So yes, this is a great topic, and one most everybody asks about, and that we're still working through, frankly. You know, we receive still most of our reports through NRC. I believe that there is a strong educational element that needs to be promoted to educate people about not just what needs to be reported, but that it requires, even if you report to NRC, you still need to call the NTSB or go on the webpage or send an email. The information is there to give the NRC report number, because the faster we have that information, the better. And the biggest benefit of this is the education that we derive from more data, and it provides us with the range of products that we're trying to develop. And so some of the incident reports will be in a tracking and trending bucket. Certainly they help us on our deployment decisions. As you know, many times media is the first source of information. But in terms of guidance, we're reviewing the information and the requests that we have received from your organization as well as others, and we will respond in kind. We haven't worked through that yet, but we definitely want to benefit from the information, additional information we're receiving. And as I've mentioned to many people, sometimes it's a release, but there was such a positive mitigation to that release that those are used as great examples of the technology and process and procedures that we have today. So they're not all negative. Does that answer your question, Fritz?
Yeah, I think so. I think everyone is just still trying to get our head around the rule. And, I know that we've talked about it within the committee, and everyone had to create procedures around the rules of when to report and when to not report and when you would report to the NRC, but maybe not the CSB. And the lag, I think the threshold for reporting lost opportunity and the lag that you may not know that for a while, and that balance of reporting, potentially too soon, what the agency is going to do with the data. So there's still some uncertainty around that, and I think some consternation.
So from my current understanding, Chris, the NRC data is still more comprehensive than what we're receiving. In any case, even if we don't have the NRC report yet, and we get those on a daily basis, but I don't know what the lag is of I'm still waiting for the data on the lag between reporting directly to NRC versus reporting direct to us, because NRC needs time to comb through and sift through based on the criteria we provided. But there are, I don't know, an order of magnitude more reports going through NRC that we never get. So I would like to produce some of that data to help people understand. But it's really important that the best thing we can do is learn about it as soon as possible. And this is not a punitive thing. So I'll go back to something that I talked about yesterday, which is, the purpose is not to punish people for reporting. The purpose is to learning from this. And if we see trends that have, multiple events with common themes, this helps us to bring that back to the community. And it's not to crucify any of the agencies, especially in the cases where, you're being extra conservative and reporting what you're not sure, maybe a reportable event, and you have 30 days to update that, etc. But I would say the sooner that we know, the better, because as soon as we get an event, we hear about it on the news, right? I track the news quite a bit. I know my team does. And we immediately reach out to OSHA. Jim Frederick is a great counterpart for that. And EPA, and we see, are you going, who's going, what are you doing, what do you know? We call the company if for some reason they didn't know to report to us. And we get on it right away. The sooner we have information, the better. So that's a message I would get across. Our job is to investigate, we're not regulating and providing oversight to your constituents or anybody that might be on this call today. The entire chemical community, we are there to help learn and to distribute those lessons, and yes, in the cases where recommendations are warranted, absolutely get those recommendations out. And if there's an urgent recommendation that needs to go out, typically that's done with a company or an association immediately. It's not something that's done in a vacuum.
Great. Well, hey, we've got a couple of minutes. Any closing comments or final thoughts for the group today? We really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule. I think everyone should see relief here in this space with what you've told us today and your enthusiasm you bring to your job, and we're excited about that. So I'll kind of turn it over to you to close us out here.
I appreciate that, Fritz. I think we need to, carefully think about really sticking back with the human factors theme. We need to really carefully think through what each operator needs to be very successful at their job. So many facilities are no longer located in rural areas. This is no different from aviation, where airports were typically designed far outside of the city limits. So we're having to deal with that. And as you know, it's not just the health of the operators we're concerned about, it's the health of the surrounding communities. So I would leave you with that it's operators it's our operations and the health of our business, as well as the health of our communities, that we're all concerned about, to make sure that every worker comes home safely, and every community member is not displaced from their homestead, especially, during holidays or for extended periods, or traumatized. So I know that the amazing things that AFPN, your organization, and your teams and your participants have been conducting and have achieved. And I'll go back to that first question or second question. I was very impressed, and I remain to be impressed, and I look forward to learning even more about your operations to better understand, so that we can have the most productive recommendations, and the most productive and wise votes.
Well, that takes us right on time. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for being with us today, and all of your great insight, and mostly good luck. Good luck with your new job, and getting your organization back on track.
Thank you so much, Fritz. I appreciate it, and thanks to the entire team at AFPM for your support.
Thank you.